We are sometimes approached with a request for a video with an example of a basic workflow while calling with FastRawViewer. Let's examine such a workflow using a casual shoot of the architectural elements of the Washington National Cathedral. The shoot took place on a sunny day both inside and outside the cathedral. As such, the scenes for all of the shots have fairly wide dynamic ranges. Some of the series of shots are rather long, but we'll show you that you should not be afraid of shooting long series in RAW, bracketing for the sake of the best possible exposure, HDR, focus stacking, panoramas, or simply catching the right moment. Using FastRawViewer, you'll be able to choose the best shots from a series quickly and reliably. Let's launch FastRawViewer. FastRawViewer can read files from any media, ranging from a memory card to a network server, so there is no need to copy shots from a memory card onto a computer hard drive to start culling. Simply insert the card into the computer. As you can see, FastRawViewer immediately noticed the inserted card and is offering to open the most recent folder with shots. We're going to do preliminary shot selection. This means that we're choosing shots suitable for further work in a RAW converter. Our criteria are the shot's composition and the technical quality of the shot, chiefly its exposure, and as such, noise.
It's necessary to remember that the higher the exposure, the lower the noise level.
Therefore, if we have a series of shots taken with bracketing, we're going to try and choose the shots with the highest possible exposure, with the only limit being not having important highlights, and we stress important here, be blown out. That is the kind of shot that will simultaneously have minimal noise, in maximal detail in the shadows, highlights, and everywhere really. It is customary to refer to such shots as properly exposed to the right, or ETTR'd. Some RAW converters apply hidden, that is, uncontrolled by the user, exposure correction to every shot, to place the midtone where, according to the logic of this converter, the midtones are supposed to be. Very often, if this correction has a positive value, this results in the increased brightness of a shot as displayed in a RAW converter, and thus compressed or even clipped highlights.
To match the brightness of an image as displayed by an Adobe RAW converter, FastRawViewer provides the Apply Hidden Adobe Exposure Correction option, which, by the way, is the default setting in FastRawViewer.
We want to see what actually happened in the RAW and evaluate the actual technical quality of the scene, and not look at a refined, cooked picture. So we're going to open the preferences and turn off Apply Hidden Adobe Exposure Correction. Since we're working with a card, the shots we've picked are going to be copied to a separate folder on a hard drive. You can use a network drive too. Important note: when working with a card, we do not recommend using the move function for keepers or for rejected files, because if the hardware glitches while moving the file, you risk losing the originals. It is always safer to treat a card in the computer as read-only, until you are ready to format it. For each shot being copied, we can choose to either create a folder for the copy, press C, or automatically copy it to the same folder as the previous shot, Shift C. If you prefer to copy the entire shoot from a card to a hard drive, then while choosing files you can use the move and reject functions. We will discuss them later. To speed up all operations, I am going to use keyboard shortcuts as much as possible. I have tuned them according to my habits. So, if the default keyboard shortcuts are not what you are accustomed to, you can assign your familiar combinations through the Keyboard Shortcuts editor. For the initial evaluation of the technical quality of a shot, we're going to use the raw histogram, toggle F2 by default, or H in my set of shortcuts, raw exposure statistics, toggle F4 by default, or S in my set, over and underexposure indication, based directly on the raw data, toggle O and U consequently, shadow boost, an indispensable tool for shadow evaluation, a must-use while calling HDR scenes, Shift S, and focus peaking, toggle P, to evaluate in-focus areas and noise in the shadows. Mode E, Edges, gives one a good overview of the sharp edges in the shot, while for the evaluation of noise in the shadows you can use Mode D, Details, and watch the density of the red dots in the deep shadows. Let's start culling. Here's a shot that was taken while approaching the cathedral. It has a pretty high dynamic range. First, let's set the underexposure detection limit and shadow boost amount. Go to Preferences, Image Display. The dynamic range of this camera at the base ISO of 100 is close to 10 EV. So let's set the underexposure detection limit below sensor saturation to 9 EV, to keep it safe and clean. For this type of scene, containing only a limited amount of areas having not very deep shadows, we recommend setting shadow boost to 0.3. For every shot, we look at the raw histogram, choosing, if possible, the shot where the histogram is reaching but not climbing the right wall. This type of histogram means that this shot has the hottest possible exposure without blown out highlights, which ensures the lowest possible noise in the shadows and full detail in the highlights. It looks like shot 4003 is the best from an exposure point of view, so we'll copy it to the folder, which we will create now. We will copy any and all other keepers to the same folder. If you were culling your raw shots using embedded JPEGs, you would decide that this shot is terribly overexposed in the red channel, while the brightness of the embedded JPEG of the shot that in fact is exposed 2/3 of an EV lower, 4001, would look close enough to the brightness of the raw shot exposed by 1/3 of an EV higher than our keeper, shot 4004. Embedded and out-of-camera JPEGs tend to exaggerate the brightness by about half to 1 stop, which, if we set the exposure by the in-camera histogram, results in suboptimal exposure in the raw. So much for the reliability of culling raw based on its JPEG preview. One more thing, in JPEG, white balance is applied, creating the impression that the red channel is heavily blown out here, while in RAW, the red channel has a leeway of about 1 stop. Next group. Looks like shot 4008 is exposed highest. Could it be exposed hotter? Let's add plus 1/3 exposure correction in FastRawViewer. Statistics show significant blowout increase, but still within the manageable margin, below 0.3%. We will be covering this in considerable detail a bit later. Examining the series, we can see how the amount of pixels below our underexposure margin is decreasing. The red channel indicates 11, 8, 6, 4% of underexposed pixels. With 1/3 EV hotter exposure, we can expect the number to be around 2%. So yes, it would be better if a shot with plus 1/3 EV was available, but we do not have one. Let's estimate possible problems with the shot we have. The raw histogram shows that this shot is underexposed, and the exposure statistics show the percentages of underexposed pixels in every channel. Let's look at the underexposure indication. Not very encouraging. However, if we press Shift-S for shadow boost, we'll see that we have a lot of details in the shadows, and they can be saved during the raw processing stage. Focus peaking demonstrates that the noise in the shadows is not too objectionable. Let's assign a label to this shot. You can choose the labels and rating style here in Preferences, XMP. From this drop-down list, I'll choose the review status, Adobe Lightroom. All label and rating options have keyboard shortcuts, of course, the memory of which you can always refresh in the XMP metadata menu and/or change those shortcuts to your convenience. We'll give the shot the label Color Correction Needed. Of course, everyone will use their preferred system. We can also assign some rating to the shot and give it a title and description, which you can edit at any time. All of this XMP metadata will be saved in an XMP sidecar file. I would like to make one more remark regarding the shot. If a polarizing filter was used for this shot and properly rotated, the glass panel covering the right door would not have a reflection on it. We'll keep this shot for raw conversion, realizing that it will need some careful work. This shot with the gargoyle, 4009, is the only one, so even if we're not happy with the exposure,
We'll give it good to use label and a 3-star rating, and keep it. Shift-C.
we will look at this shot in FastRawViewer once more a little bit later. We'll do the same with shot 4010.
Assign it the good to use label and a 3-star rating, and copy it.
Next series.
Let's immediately turn on overexposure indication.
Looks like the best shot here is 4013. We have a clipped highlight only on the sunlit window. Underexposed areas don't seem to have a lot of noise, and they are not significant in any way, size, or composition. I don't know why these shots were taken with ISO 800. Here we see basic EXIF information, and if we want detailed EXIF info, we can press F3 by default, or E in MySet, or whatever keyboard shortcut you assign to the EXIF panel. For this model of camera, as well as for many other cameras based on Sony sensors that do not employ DRPix technology, increasing the ISO higher than 200 won't give you any benefits in terms of decreasing noise. What will be significantly decreased when stepping over ISO 200 is the total dynamic range of the camera.
For all current Canon DSLR cameras, as well as for some Nikon cameras, especially those with larger pixels like the D3 and D4 series,
it is reasonable to increase ISO, up to some point of course, very seldom higher than 1600, to decrease noise in the shadows, but when one shoots in RAW, increasing ISO should be the last resort, used only when the shutter speed is already at its lowest possible for the shooting situation, aperture at its fastest, and more light is not an option. Increasing ISO inevitably clips highlights, thus decreasing available dynamic range. So, if highlights are not as important as shadows, and you can't increase exposure or add more light, you can increase the ISO. But it is always good to check what the reasonable ceiling for increasing ISO for the specific camera is. Meanwhile, if you have the specular highlights in a shot, let them go. Or you would be choosing a shot about 2 stops lower in exposure. That could be very dangerous noise-wise. Use the overexposure overlay to see what exactly is blown out in a shot, and if it is only specular highlights and light sources, don't discard the shot and don't try looking for a better exposed one. Let's look at the series taken at the odd ISO 3200. We know that the higher the ISO, the narrower the camera's dynamic range. The dynamic range of this camera at ISO 3200 is approximately 5.5 eV. So, to get the correct statistics and underexposure indication, we go to Preferences and change underexposure detection limit below sensor saturation to 5.5 eV.
let's dock the histogram and exposure statistics on the left and move from shot to shot, looking at the histogram, exposure statistics, and under and overexposure overlays. Shot 4015. Shot 4016. Shot 4017. Let's return the histogram and exposure statistics panels to the right side of the window.
Though shot 4016 looks better than the others, we do have 26% of underexposed pixels in the red channel. Look at the area covered with underexposure indication also. Such an amount of underexposed pixels means rather high noise, at least in the red channel. This is exactly what we will see in D mode of focus peaking. These red ants covering the cathedral's walls are noise. We can also see that we have a rather higher level of noise by looking at the channels separately. Red, blue, green. While blue and green don't have visible noise, the red channel doesn't look so good. If we want this shot anyway, we'll keep it, but we will remember to never use such low exposure for this camera, and also remember that bumping ISO here is not an answer. It only results in limiting our exposure choices through the clipping of highlights. We'll assign the label retouching needed and give it some title and description. Were this series taken at ISO 200 and a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second, no problem with hand-holding for a 40mm lens with this shutter speed, the noise would be significantly lower, as the exposure for 1/200th of a second is 16 times higher than 1/3200th. Compromising on the exposure only 8 times higher, we could have used 1/400th of a second for the shutter speed, still much less noise, and no blown-out highlights at all.
Let's now move inside the cathedral.
Here we have a series of shots of a scene with a higher dynamic range than outside. We have both sunlit stained glass windows and more or less deep shadows, which are important for the composition of the shot and need some level of details. This means that we will probably always have some over and some underexposed pixels. First of all, we need to adjust the shadow boost accordingly. We recommend setting the shadow boost amount for such scenes to 0.5.
Also, we're going to set the underexposure detection limit below sensor saturation to 10 eV, because the ISO is 100 again.
Let's try to pick the shot where we have an acceptable exposure balance, exposed to the right as much as possible, but with a percentage of blown out pixels not exceeding 1% in every channel. Better if less. With 1% of blown out pixels, we still have a good chance of highlight recovery to do a decent job in RAW conversion. Nevertheless, limiting the blown out pixels to one channel only, and not in excess of 0.3% to 0.4%, is recommended for non-neutral subjects. However, As a routine, overexposure and clipping are ignored for any specular highlights, direct light sources, subjects to be cropped off, and insignificant parts of the composition.
Watch the overexposure overlay in addition to the statistics to see what parts of the image exactly are clipped due to overexposure.
We can formulate the exposure balance criteria in a different manner. We will consider the exposure to be the best available if, on a less exposed shots, shadows are significantly worse, while the shot doesn't provide any significant improvement in the highlights, and vice versa, a hotter exposed shot resulted in a significant increase in the number of blown out pixels in an important area of the shot, while not providing any significant improvement in the shadows. For this series, we'll show that when choosing a keeper, we must also take into consideration what we're going to do with the image in further processing. We'll move from shot to shot and look at the raw statistics and the over and underexposure overlays. Shot 4018 fits the first part of our criteria, not more than 1% of overexposed pixels, but is a little bit outside of the second part, limiting the blown out pixels to one channel only, and not in excess of 0.3% to 0.4%. Let's turn on the overexposure overlay. This hotspot on the table might be recovered at the raw conversion stage. The only problem I see here is that we've nearly lost the colors on the leftmost stained glass window. They're heavily blown out. So, if we are ready to rely on the highlight recovery mechanisms in a raw converter and are ready to touch up the stained glass windows, we can keep this shot. But let's see what we got by decreasing the exposure. We turn on the underexposure overlay to immediately see which areas are affected and continue to move forward. For shot 4019, minus 130V, we see some improvement in the highlights, a decrease in the percentage of overexposed pixels from 0.6% to 0.3% in the green channel, and a teeny tiny increase in the percentage of underexposed pixels, 0.01% in the blue channel. Shot 4020, negative 2/3 EV. We again decrease the percentage of overexposed pixels by a little bit, this time in the red and blue channels, and again increase the percentage of underexposed pixels by a teeny tiny amount, to 0.05% in the blue channel. The underexposure indication shows that the underexposed areas are really insignificant. Moving to shot 4021, negative 1 EV, we see that the percentage of overexposed pixels is insignificantly changed, and only in the green channel, while the percentage of underexposed pixels starts to increase substantially, from 0.05% to 0.3% in the blue channel. This means that shot 4020 is the threshold. Decreasing exposure from here on out won't do any good in the highlights, but will definitely worsen the shadows. Let's use Shadow Boost to determine what we have in the shadows. We see that we have plenty of details in the shadows both for shot 4019 and 4020. As for the noise, it is mainly in the blue channel. Let's zoom, and switching per channel views. See? The red and green channels don't have any noise, while the blue channel has some. Not of any significance though. So if we do not want to work on the highlights in a raw converter, we will probably choose shot 4020. If we're going to compose an HDR, we will keep shot 4018 with 0% of underexposed pixels, and shot 4023 with minimal available percentage of overexposed pixels. But if we were using embedded JPEGs for culling raw, we would probably disregard shot 4023. Why? Let's zoom this shot and look at the stained glass window above the entrance door. Of course, it is not the best possible sharpness, but it is a usable situation. Now look at this window on the embedded JPEG. Impressive blur! Would you keep this shot based on the JPEG preview? I doubt it. This JPEG unsharpness, while the original RAW is sharp enough, is most dangerous with Sony cameras, where the embedded JPEG has 1616 pixels along the longest dimension, less than many of today's monitors. So when you are zooming into such a JPEG, it gets more and more blurred, providing the wrong impression of RAW, which in fact might be quite sharp. For this scene, I would prefer the shot without people in it, and I'm not going to compose an HDR here. But if I'm going to recover highlights in a RAW converter, will the final quality of the image be satisfactory? I can check that immediately. Just run a RAW converter directly from FastRawViewer. Yes, we can run external programs directly from FastRawViewer. Upon launch, FastRawViewer detects RAW converters such as Adobe Lightroom, Adobe Photoshop, Capture One on your computer and automatically sets them as available external programs. You can change them at any time and or add up to 10 external programs. Also, you can set your preferred shortcuts to run each of these programs. If I want to immediately check what can be done with some shot on a RAW converter, or evaluate this shot more in RAWDigger, then while the shot is open on the main window, I can just press the shortcuts assigned to the desirable program.
When you're just checking one image in a RAW converter, we recommend using a converter that doesn't create catalogs. I use Adobe Camera Raw or RPP. In this case, we need to counteract Adobe's hidden correction, and also, let's set recovery to 10.
It looks like we can recover the highlights here with decent quality.
So, I'll assign shot 4018 the color correction needed label and keep it.
We would like to stress here one more thing. If we look at the raw histogram, we'll see that the blue channel is behind the red and the green. This means that the blue channel was exposed lower than the red and green channels. Furthermore, per channel view shows that most of the detail is in the red channel. If the shot was taken with a cyan filter, this filter would back off the red channel, and we would be able to increase exposure without the risk of blown out pixels in the red channel. So we would have gotten the green and blue channels exposed hotter, reducing the noise in the shadows. Incidentally, longer exposure also helps blurring visitors. It may sound a little odd, but when shooting while having people in the scene, sometimes it is best to shoot when they are moving to get that blur. Next series. Here, we want to preserve the way the light coming through the stained glass plays on the wall, right here, at the top of the hall. Of course, we understand that by decreasing the exposure in order to preserve lamp spots, we win very little. Look at the overexposure indication. This is typical for light sources and specular highlights. There's no point in saving them here. They are not the subject of the shot. Shot 4024 is the hottest one we have, and after recovering the highlights in a raw converter, it will be quite okay. Shot 4025 is the threshold. There's no point to move further along the way of decreasing exposure. We won't improve the situation with the highlights, but we will significantly worsen the shadows. We'll use Shadow Boost again to make sure that the shadows on both 4024 and 4025 are not all that noisy. They look quite safe.
I'll assign shot 4025 the color correction needed label and a 5-star rating, and copy it.
Next scene. We have a scene with large areas of very deep shadows and extremely important bright highlights. If we want to get a good picture of the stained glass window, preserving highlights, even by means of sacrificing the arch's details in the shadows, is crucial. Here, we will adjust the shadow boost once again. For such scenes with big areas of very deep shadows, we recommend setting the shadow boost to 0.7 or 0.8. Here again, we'll have to decide how we're going to deal with the scene later. Are we going to get as much as possible from only one shot, or are we going to keep a couple of shots and to compose an HDR in Adobe Photoshop or another photo editing application? Let's move from file to file, looking at the raw exposure statistics. On shot 4028, the highlights were completely preserved. The histogram reaches the wall and is just slightly touching it, and exposure statistics show close to 0% of overexposed pixels. The problem here is that in deep shadows, white balance is distorted, so it would be difficult to balance the shot properly. We can see that by using Shadow Boost. Deep shadow recovery is often limited by the irregular white balance, not just noise. If we are planning to pick just one shot, no HDR composing later, shot 4029 is the best. The histogram is touching the right wall. Exposure statistics show negligible percentage of overexposed pixels, 0.01% in the red and blue channels and 0.1 in the green channel. The stained glass is thus captured in full detail. But as you can see, the underexposure on the arches is huge. Let's use Shadow Boost. We can see that in reality we have a lot of details in the shadows, and focus peaking in detail mode indicates that these shadows are not too noisy. So we can recover them somewhat during raw processing. We do not want them to stand out anyway, just enough to recreate the atmosphere. If we're going to compose in HDR, we will keep shot 4028 with the highlights and colors of the stained glass completely preserved, and also shot 4032 taken with 2-second shutter speed with completely blown out highlights, but 0% of underexposed pixels.
I'm not going to make an HDR here, so we'll keep shot 4029.
The situation is the same with the next stained glass window. We keep the shot with the smallest percentage of overexposed pixels, 4033. Shadow Boost shows us that we also have a lot of details in the shadows, and not too much noise. But let's keep 4036 too, in case we decide to compose an HDR from these two shots. Note that we can't really use a hotter exposed shot, 4037, because with higher exposure we're starting to get too much flare on the surrounding stone walls. We now have a folder containing the results of the preliminary culling. We will open this folder and demonstrate a couple more raw-based tools allowing one to not only evaluate what can be done with the shot at the raw conversion stage, but also to speed up that stage. Do you remember the shots with the gargoyles we were planning to have another look at? The ones that were underexposed, but we kept them since we didn't have a better exposed one? We assigned them the good to use label and a 3-star rating.
Since we don't have that many shots, we can see all of them in the film strip. However, if we had a huge amount of shots, we could use a filter to select the shots that we now want to work on.
Press Shift F and check the good to use field in the label column and 3 stars in the rating column in the opened panel. Press Apply. Now we will be presented only with those files which have both a good to use label and a 3-star rating.
Here, I want to show how to use another very useful tool provided by FastRawViewer called propagation. It allows you to apply the exposure correction, white balance, and/or orientation adjustments made to the first shot of a series to all preceding shots of the series, significantly reducing the time used for processing a series of similar shots, such as panoramas, HDRs, different views of the same scene, object, etc. To propagate white balance, we go to the Preferences, White Balance. From the drop-down White Balance for Next File, Same Camera menu, choose Same as Previous, and check Keep Custom White Balance for the next file, Same Camera. If we wanted to propagate exposure correction as well, we would open the Image Display tab in the Preferences, and from the drop-down Exposure Correction on File Open menu, choose Keep from Previous File.
Using the exposure correction tool, let's increase the overall brightness of shot 4009. While increasing the exposure correction, we look at the exposure statistics, paying attention now to the overexposure plus correction column. By default, this column appears when you start using the exposure correction tool, but you can change settings so they will always be present. Just click on the gear icon and choose this option. We increase the exposure correction value, Alt++, or here at the bottom bar, according to the same rule as we had to a basic overexposure statistic. That is, until the percentage of overexposed pixels in the overexposure plus correction column in every channel does not exceed 1%. It is important to note that raw data is not changed and all the corrections can easily be undone, not only in FastRawViewer, but also in a raw converter. We see that with an exposure correction of +1 in 130V, we got exactly what we were aiming for. This exposure correction will be saved in an XMP file so that the Adobe Raw Converter, or any other raw converter that honors the XMP, will start from the corrections done in FastRawViewer, and we won't have to do it again. Saving XMP files is the default option. You can always decline it by changing the settings in the preferences. Now we can apply white balance to this shot. We can try one of the presets, for example daylight. Also, we can choose using color temperature and tint, or color temperature and mired if you prefer. Just make the necessary adjustments in the preferences. I prefer to apply custom white balance to this shot, that is, Alt-click on the area I know to be neutral. This custom white balance will also be saved in the XMP file, and the shot will be opened in a raw converter with this white balance setting. And we add a title and a description.
As you can see, I'm just giving an example of how one would go about doing this.
Let's do the same with shot 4010.
Since we allowed white balance propagation, the shot is opened with the same custom white balance as the previous one. So, we need to choose proper exposure correction, whose step size, incidentally, you can change in the preferences, and add a title and a description.
As we can see, we can make basic adjustments, such as exposure correction, white balance, orientation if necessary, to all keepers. We clear the filter settings, and going through the keepers apply white balance, and, if necessary, exposure correction.
Let's do this for shots 4018 and 4025. We choose a white balance for shot 4018, and the same white balance will be propagated to shot 4025.
Of course, if you have a limited number of keepers, you can apply white balance and exposure correction during the preliminary culling. But when I have a very large amount of shots, I prefer to do it in 2 steps, so as to not get bogged down. Since we have those files on the hard drive, we can safely move, not only copy, some of them into another folder. Same as for copying. For each shot being moved, you can choose or create a folder for the move, press M, or automatically move it to the same folder as the previous file was moved to, Shift-M. Also, since we are working with a hard drive, we can move some shots, which we decided not to keep, into the rejected subfolder. This subfolder is created inside the folder we are working with. As you can see, the main operations within the rejected subfolder also have keyboard shortcuts, which, as always, you can modify to your convenience. Anytime later, you can access the file and move to the rejected subfolder, check them again, move those files you decided to keep out of the rejected subfolder, and only when you are absolutely sure that you don't need those files, which are left in the rejected, you can clear the rejected subfolder.
When you clear the rejected subfolder, the files therein are not deleted, but rather moved to the trash bin. This provides an additional security measure against accidental deletion.
And one more thing. We often hear that it is impossible both to see and to show RAW files without converting them to another format, like JPEG, TIFF, etc. With FastRawViewer, you can not only see and evaluate your RAW shots, you can present them to your customers or family or friends immediately. You can make some adjustments to an image display. For example, you can apply a contrast tone curve to one of the gargoyles, shots 4009 or 4010. As you can see, there are a lot of different presets here. I chose black and white movie because I'd like to add some more contrast to the scene. Or if you want a little softer, we can use standard tone. Or look at the shot in black and white mode. So together with your customer, you can choose and agree on the style of post-processing. Finally, we can import the folder with the keepers to Adobe Lightroom. Given that we have significantly reduced the quantity of files needing to be imported, and for most of them we have already done some basic adjustments, exposure correction, white balance, orientation if necessary, XMP metadata, we have dramatically reduced both time and hardware resources, both necessary for processing files from the shooting session and dealing with catalog optimization later.
And please remember,
when you are just starting with a new camera, or you are shooting under such conditions that it is quite difficult to set the correct shooting parameters on the fly, you might need to shoot long series to choose the correct shot later. With FastRawViewer, you can be sure that not only will you choose the best shot of the series, but that you will be able to do it fast.
thank you for watching our video, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us.